Glendale, California, the spring of 1958. A Saturday morning in Verdugo Park. On the east side of the park, where the baseball diamonds were laid out in a row of three, each one with a chain-link backstop and a dugout on each side, and the specific worn quality of public park baseball diamonds that are used hard through the spring and summer and never quite recover before the next spring begins. The grass in the outfield was the grass of a public park maintained on a municipal budget, which meant it was cut but not manicured, green in patches and brown in others. The kind of outfield that produced unpredictable bounces and that the boys who played on it had learned to compensate for in the specific way that boys learn to compensate for the conditions they play in, which is by adjusting their expectations of the ball rather than the field. It was 9:45 in the morning. The air was the air of a Glendale Saturday in April, cool enough for a jacket in the shade and warm enough without one in the sun, the specific April air of the San Gabriel Valley before the summer heat arrived and changed everything about what it felt like to be outside. The game was scheduled to begin at 10. It was a Little League game between the Glendale Braves and the Burbank Cardinals, two teams of boys between the ages of 10 and 12 who had been practicing since February and who had arrived at this particular Saturday with a record that mattered to them in the specific way that records matter to boys of that age, which is completely and without the perspective that later years produce. The Glendale Braves had arrived in two station wagons driven by two of the fathers. The Burbank Cardinals had arrived in a bus that their league had arranged. The boys had taken the field for warm-ups. The coaches had met at home plate and exchanged lineup cards. The umpire, a man named Gerald Watts, who was 51 years old and had been umpiring Little League games in the Glendale area since 1947, had taken his position behind the plate and adjusted his mask and looked out at the field with the specific professional attention of a man who has done something thousands of times and still does it with care. And the stands were empty. Not thin, empty. The metal bleachers on both sides of the diamond, 4 rows high and 30 feet long, held not a single person. No parents, no siblings, no neighbors who had come to watch. The boys in the Glendale Braves dugout knew this. They had arrived at the park at 9:15, 45 minutes before the game, which was when their coach told them to arrive, and they had come out of the station wagons with their equipment bags and their gloves and the specific focused energy of boys who have been thinking about this game since Wednesday and are now finally in the place where the game is going to happen. They had looked at the stands on the way to the dugout, the way players look at stands, not consciously, but as part of the general taking in of the environment that athletes do when they arrive at a venue. The stands had been empty then. They were empty now at 9:45. They would be empty at 10 when the game began. The boys in the Glendale Braves dugout knew this. They had looked at the stands before warm-ups and had seen what was in them and had said nothing to each other about it, because there was nothing to say that would make the seeing of it any different, and because they were 10 and 11 and 12 years old and had not yet developed the vocabulary for what it felt like to be ready to play the most important game of your young season and to look at the stands and find them holding no one who had come to watch you play it. The boy who noticed the man first was named Danny Kowalski. He noticed him between innings, in the specific interval of an inning change when the fielders are coming in and the batters are going out, and there is a moment of reorganization on the field that allows the eyes to move elsewhere without missing anything. He was in the Glendale Braves dugout, tightening the laces of his right cleat, when he looked up at the stands for the third time that morning and saw that one of the sections was no longer entirely empty. He was 11 years old and played second base for the Glendale Braves, and had been playing baseball since he was 7, and had, in those 4 years, developed the specific love of the game that some boys develop, and that is different from the enjoyment of playing it, different from the satisfaction of doing it well, which is a love that encompasses the game itself in all its conditions, the good games and the bad ones, the games played in good weather and the games played in rain, the games where everything works and the games where nothing does. He loved it the way people love things that have become part of how they understand themselves. He was in the Glendale Braves dugout at 9:52 when he looked up at the stands for the third time that morning and saw that one of them was no longer empty. A man had sat down in the second row of the first base bleachers. He had come from the parking area to the east and had walked along the fence and had found a seat in the middle of the second row and had sat down with the specific settled quality of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive and is now in the place he intended to be. He was wearing a plain canvas jacket over a dark shirt and a hat that he had not removed when he sat down. Danny Kowalski looked at the man for a moment. He looked at the man's size first, because the man was large enough that his size was the first thing you noticed. And then he looked at his face, and the looking at his face produced in Danny Kowalski the specific calculation that 11-year-old brains perform when they see something that matches a stored image in a context where the stored image was not expected. He said nothing. He looked back at the field. He picked up his glove. John Wayne was in Glendale because he had been driving. He had left his house in Encino at 8:30 on a Saturday morning because he had no particular place to be until 2 in the afternoon. And because Saturday mornings in Encino in the spring were the kind of Saturday mornings that made a man want to be in motion rather than stationary, the light and the air producing a specific restlessness that the house could not accommodate. He had driven east on Ventura, and then south on the 2, and then east on Colorado, in the specific aimless way that his drives worked when they were good, which was without destination and without the pressure of a destination, the car finding its way through the morning light and the Saturday traffic of the San Fernando Valley and the foothills in the way that a river finds its way downhill, by following the path that offered the least resistance and occasionally producing, by that method, a view or a place or a moment that a plan would never have found, and had found himself in Glendale without having planned to be in Glendale, which was the way his drives usually worked, which was that they went where the road and the light suggested, rather than where a plan directed. He had passed Verdugo Park at 9:40 and had seen the baseball diamonds from the road, and had turned in because baseball diamonds in the morning were one of the things he turned in for, the way other men turned in for diners or hardware stores, or the particular view from a particular overlook. He had parked and walked to the nearest diamond, and had seen the boys in warm-ups and the empty stands, and had sat down in the second row of the first base bleachers, because the second row was where you could see the whole field clearly and still be close enough to hear the sounds of the game. The sounds that baseball produces that are different from the sounds of any other game. The specific acoustic combination of ball and glove and bat and dirt, and the voices of boys playing it. He had sat down with the intention of watching for a few innings, and then continuing his drive. He was 50 years old, and had been playing and watching baseball since he was a child in Winterset, Iowa, where the game had the specific importance that baseball has in small Midwestern towns in the first half of the 20th century, which is the importance of the thing that everyone does and everyone watches, and that serves as the common language of a community that does not have many other languages. He had left Iowa at 18 and had not lived there since, but the baseball had stayed with him in the way that the things you learn as a child stay with you. When the place that taught them is long behind you, and had never, in the 40-plus years since, lost the specific pleasure of watching it played by people for whom the playing of it was the most important thing happening in their world at that moment. The game began at 10:02, delayed slightly by a dispute about the lineup card that Gerald Watts resolved in 4 minutes, with the practiced authority of a man who has resolved this dispute many times before, and who has developed, through the resolution of it across hundreds of games, a specific economy of language for the resolution that leaves no room for the dispute to continue once the resolution has been delivered. The first inning went quickly, the way first innings go when both pitchers are throwing strikes, which these two were, both of them 10-year-olds who had been practicing since February, and who had the specific focused concentration of boys for whom this game was the most important thing that had happened all week. That Gerald Watts resolved in 4 minutes with the practiced authority of a man who has resolved this dispute many times before. The Glendale Braves batted first. Danny Kowalski batted third. He grounded out to short on a pitch that was low and outside, and that he should not have swung at, and that he swung at anyway, because he was 11 years old, and the specific discipline of not swinging at low outside pitches is a discipline that takes years to build, and he was only 4 years into the building of it. He trotted back to the dugout with the specific expression that boys carry after grounding out, the expression that is trying to be neutral and is not quite succeeding. He looked at the stands. The man was still there. He was watching the field with the complete attention of someone for whom baseball was worth watching completely, not the divided attention of a person doing 2 things at once, but the full attention of someone who is doing one thing and has decided that the one thing deserves all of it. By the 3rd inning, some of the other boys had noticed the man in the 2nd row, not because anyone pointed or said anything, but because boys at a baseball game do what people at baseball games do, which is scan the stands in the intervals between action, and the stands on this particular Saturday contained exactly one person in them, which made the scanning simple and the noticing inevitable. By the 5th inning, all of them had. The knowledge had passed through the Glendale Braves dugout in the specific way that knowledge passes through groups of boys at that age, which is not by announcement or declaration, but by the accumulated evidence of glances and the small conversations that glances produce when they are all directed at the same thing. The whispered identifications and the quiet confirmations and the specific collective decision reached without discussion about how to handle what they knew. By the 5th inning, all of them had. The knowledge had passed through the Glendale Braves dugout in the specific way that knowledge passes through groups of boys, not by announcement, but by the accumulated evidence of glances and the small conversations that glances produce. Nobody said his name out loud. They were 10 and 11 and 12 years old, and they understood, without being told, that saying the name out loud would change the morning into something it was not currently being, and that what it was currently being which was a baseball game being watched with complete attention by someone who had chosen to watch it, was something worth preserving. The game ended at 12:17. The Glendale Braves won 4-2. Danny Kowalski went 2 for 3 with a walk and scored once and made a play in the fourth inning on a ground ball up the middle that he reached by going to his right and throwing across his body to first. That was the best play he had made all season, and that he would remember for the rest of his life, not only for the play itself, but for the fact of who was sitting in the second row of the first base bleachers when he made it. After the final out, Gerald Watts called the game and removed his mask and tucked it under his arm and walked to home plate to shake the hands of both coaches in the specific ritual ending of a Little League game that has been the same ritual for as long as Little League has existed. John Wayne stood from the bleachers. He had been sitting in the second row for 2 hours and 15 minutes. He had watched every pitch of every inning with the complete attention he had brought to the first pitch of the first inning, the attention of a man for whom this game, played by boys on a public park diamond in Glendale on a Saturday morning in April, was worth watching completely. He walked to the fence near the Glendale Braves dugout. The boys came out of the dugout toward the parking area and passed near the fence. He said good game to each of them as they passed. He said it to each one individually, not as a group, each boy receiving his own version of it with the specific eye contact and the specific tone that made it not a thing said to a crowd, but a thing said to a person. He said it to the pitcher who had thrown 7 strong innings. He said it to the first baseman who had made 3 errors and had not let the errors change his effort on the subsequent plays. He said it to Danny Kowalski, who was one of the last ones through the gate, and he said something additional to Danny Kowalski that he did not say to the others, which was that the play in the fourth inning on the ball up the middle was the kind of play that separates players who rely on their range from players who rely on their reads, and that Danny Kowalski was developing the second kind. Danny Kowalski was 11 years old and did not entirely understand what this meant. He understood it better 10 years later when he was playing college ball, and his coach said something similar about a play he had made, and he thought about the man in the second row of the first base bleachers in Verdugo Park on a Saturday morning in April 1958, and understood, 10 years later, what the man had seen. He shook the hand of the coach. He nodded to Gerald Watts. He walked back to his car in the parking area to the east. He drove west on Colorado toward the 2, and then north toward Encino. The boys of the Glendale Braves rode home in the 2 station wagons driven by the 2 fathers. Danny Kowalski sat in the back seat of the second station wagon and looked out the window at Glendale going past, and thought about the play in the fourth inning, and about the man who had been sitting in the second row when he made it, and about what it meant that the man had come and stayed for all of it, and had said good game to each of them individually on the way out. He was 11 years old and sitting in the back seat of a station wagon, going home after a baseball game his team had won, and he did not yet have the words for what it meant that a man had sat alone in the stands for the entire game and watched every inning of it and said good game to each of them on the way out. He would find the words later. The words were something like this: that the presence of a witness changes what you are doing, not the outcome of it, but the experience of it. And that a witness who chooses to be present when no one asked them to be, and no one expected them to be, is a different kind of witness from one who is obligated, and that being seen completely, every inning of it, by someone who had chosen to see you, was a thing that a boy could carry for a long time before he understood what he was carrying.